Hi there, you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast with your host, me, Simon Drew. If you'd like to listen to over 200 episodes that were recorded before 2020, then you can head to my Patreon site. It's patreon.com/Simon J.E. Drew. We'd love to have you there, and any support is greatly appreciated. We'd love to also have you on our Facebook community, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But for now, enjoy the show. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. Now, today I've got a really fascinating discussion with a repeat guest, Professor Joseph Siracusa. Now, if you haven't already checked out his previous episode a couple of weeks ago, go take a look. It's really interesting. We talk about history, philosophy, politics, current events, all sorts of things. And I was really impressed by the level of wisdom that he brought to the table in our last conversation. So I said, listen, if there's anything that you think would be interesting to discuss, tell me, and I'd love to have you back on. And one thing that we discussed in the previous episode was the power of diplomacy. And this was really fascinating to me because I've been thinking a lot about politics lately. I'm pretty much obsessed with American politics. I love it. It's good stuff. So, I'm really fascinated by that sort of stuff. And I thought, let's talk about diplomacy, the history, the usefulness, what is it? He's an expert on this. So we have such a fascinating discussion. And what I know is that if you listen carefully throughout this interview, you will find ways that you can use the techniques of diplomacy in your own life, in your career, your relationships, everything, your critical thinking. It's brilliant. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And just so you know, Joseph Siracusa, he is the Professor of Human Security and International Diplomacy at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And he's also the President Emeritus of Australia's Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. So really fascinating guy, a wealth of knowledge to share, and we're going to have him back many more times. I think next time we're going to be discussing nuclear weapons. So that's going to be a really fascinating discussion that's going to get deep. But without any further ado, I present to you Professor Joseph Siracusa. All right, so Joe, I'm excited to have you back, as you know. I guess, so just to set up the conversation, last time when we discussed, we were kind of discussing human history, like you just mentioned before we started this, you were saying how one thing you mentioned was that human nature doesn't, necessarily change. It just kind of like echoes throughout history. One thing that I really took away from our last conversation was your emphasis on the importance of diplomacy. And, this week, I've been really paying attention to the news. I go in and out of being addicted to American politics. Sometimes it's good for me, sometimes not so much. You could argue that it's never good for me, but I've been really focusing on what's been going on over there, the different relationships, say between Australia and China, America and China. There's crazy things going on all over around the world. And I've been thinking about what you said, how in times like these, diplomacy is one of the most important things that can take place. So why don't you just set it up for us? What is diplomacy and why is it so important?
Well, diplomacy, which is about the relations between states and between sub-state actors. It could be diplomacy between a transnational corporation and the country that they're in. It could be some kind of NGO like Amnesty International and how it interacts. It's about how different people, countries, units, whatever it is, interact with each other to achieve a common goal. Now, what I like about diplomacy is that not unlike some other ancient professions, and I'm talking here about history, not the other kind, has been around for a very long time. Diplomacy as a practice dates back to the Bronze Age, from the Euphrates Kingdom right through Akhenaten in the 4th century BC, up through the Egyptians and the other Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans. Diplomacy is very important, and I'm moved by a couple of lines. And one is, no wall of power has ever stopped a war without diplomacy, and no war has ever stopped without diplomacy. The diplomat, or the fancy word for it is diplomatist, is a crucial person. Now, I've met a lot of ambassadors, men and women who've given their lives, who are career ambassadors, and they all have that same sense of gravitas, and they have that same sense that they failed. they always think because wars took place or their advice was ignored or nations just simply respond to the mob in the street, that their careers are not as satisfying. But I disagree with each of them. I think being a diplomat, and I mean by being a diplomat, I mean having a calling. Today people love to throw around that expression, I got a passion to make food, and I got a passion to help people, and I got a passion to do this and that. What Max Weber's people would have said is you have, in the 19th century, you have a calling. There's an inner voice inside of you that says, you must do what you have to do, whether you are Christopher Columbus or Cortez after that, or you're Thomas Edison. There is an inner voice. And I think all the great diplomats I've met, and I've met those who negotiated limited test ban treaty. I met a guy who was in charge of Lend-Lease, a very famous guy, Governor Harriman, who worked for both John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt many years before that. These people have a sort of a greatness about what they've done. They have real diplomats, whether they're men or women I met. They have sort of a texture to their lives that nobody else has. You can make all the damn money in the world. You can retire at the age of 30. You can be Elon Musk and go to Mars. But at the end of it, you don't want to do anything he says, aside from, get on a ship maybe or something like that. These people are very wise, and most of them don't write memoirs, though they do write. They do engage in oral histories, which are contained in a different place, located in different places, like the Library of Congress. But they're very mum about what they can say after their careers are over, because the only time people are ever going to talk to you is if they know they're not going to read about this later on, particularly in countries that where life is precarious, whether it's Rwanda or North Korea. I mean, you're not going to be working for Joseph Stalin and write your memoirs because you never have a chance to read them. So these people have all done terribly interesting work, and I think the diplomacy, the diplomatic experience of each nation on Earth, and there are 195 today, maybe 140, 130 that work pretty well, and I think it reveals the soul of a nation. I mean, the reason people are so damn depressed with Donald Trump is that he is threatening, he is retreating from the world. And people have seen American presence, American values, American security involved in their lives for so long, even trade negotiations since 1945. They can't imagine what the American retreat's going to look like and whether anybody else is going to fill it up. I mean, the reason that Donald Trump is so depressing to people who have an internationalist outlook is just that he has a very nationalist outlook. Now, he's not brand new. Donald Trump's diplomacy is not new. It resonates a lot with Warren Harding in the 1920s. It turned his back on the League of Nations and the work of Woodrow Wilson. It harkens back to the time of George Washington, who in his famous address said America should avoid entangling alliances. But he didn't say America should avoid the world. He said it should avoid entangling alliances. And after America broke its security treaty with the French in the 1800s, did not have a single peacetime security treaty until NATO in 1949. Just think about that, 149 years later. So when people say, Trump's going in a new direction, actually he's going back in an old direction. And the question Americans have been asking for the last 100 years since the First World Wars, can they stay at home? That's the question. Can anybody stay at home? And I think, this is where I like you, I suppose, I've always been interested in what antiquity has to say, what we can learn from people who were there, who saw things that we can only imagine. And I think of Macaulay's famous poem about Horatius at the bridge. Now, whether it's a legend or not, or whether it actually happened or not, he is attributed with this great saying that says that when your neighbor's house is on fire, you're in trouble. And I've always thought that war and peace are indivisible. And the only way to understand war and peace is to understand it from the view of a diplomatic historian, because it subsumes economics, politics, it subsumes international relations and everything else. I mean, to be a diplomatic historian means that you have license to roam all over written history, which has been around for about 3,000 years. And you got the same, whether you walk into a village in the hills of New Guinea, or you walk into the court of Louis the 16th, or you walk into a French court, or sorry, a British court, or something like that, you got the same problems. Same way of analyzing things. You got a number of players, then you got a number of issues, and then you got a number of strategies, and then you have a number of outcomes, which as soon as the outcome is arranged, it becomes the next issue. This is how you can understand the Peace of Versailles in 1648. This is how you can understand the Peace Treaty of Versailles in 1919, because they all have the same characteristics. Now, what we have to do as civilized, educated people is to flesh them out. And these people have got some wonderful lessons. You know, there were people in 1918, 1919 at Versailles who said this isn't going to work. In fact, it's planting the seeds for the next war. And they were dead right. The trouble is they're a minority opinion. So as we go back in diplomatic history, we look at the diplomacy of things, we see that there are minority views which then become majority views later on. So it's this constant tension between the minority view and a majority view, which sort of drives history. It's sort of like the poor man's version of dialectical materialism, where we have to keep coming up with these different syntheses of ideas. Anyway, I knew I was stuck on diplomatic history the first time I read William Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I was 14 years old, and I thought, what did these Germans do to these people and to themselves and to the rest of the world? I mean, it made me very interested how people whose language is a beautiful language, who've contributed to music and other things, how they could have done this to themselves and to other people. And so you get right into their diplomacy. And when you get into someone's diplomacy, you're really trying to sense their worldview. What did Germans see in 1918 and in 1939? Who's running the show? What are the issues at stake? And so you see these different diplomatic experiences. And I think it's a very rich thing. I've written about 40 books, and about 25 of them have the word diplomatic in it. The American Diplomatic Revolution, I wrote in 1976. And then Histories on U.S. Foreign Policy. Had some popular textbooks. My little book with Oxford is in several languages, including Arabic and Vietnamese. So I wish the Vietnamese might have paid me some royalties for it. I think they did their own version. That's okay. God bless them. They can have it all. Anyway, you see that there is a renewed interest among younger people and people who are interested in the world to look at the role of diplomacy. Now, I've never much written about the history of diplomacy, that is the etiquette of the court or the Havana Convention of 1928, which sets out the terms of how you deal with people when you're overseas representing your government, or the treaties of 1969, which are confirmed in other conventions. I'm just interested in the diplomacy of ancient nations, modern nations, whatever. I'm interested in diplomacy in action. And that's where all my books are. That's why I'm a diplomatic historian and not a historian of diplomacy. That's all very important, because whether I'm looking at the Night Stalin and Churchill divided Europe in December 1944, which tells an awful lot about what's going on in the world and about the diplomatic practice currently represented, I can kind of narrow in very quickly, focus in very quickly on the conversations between Stalin and Churchill, which are a revelation. Behind closed doors, these guys speak the same language. The trouble is that while Churchill's trying to keep the British Empire together, Stalin doesn't care, and he doesn't care what's written on a piece of paper. So at the end of the day, diplomacy depends on the willingness of the other side to bring forward what you've agreed on. Because I always thought the great moments in history, the Peace of Westphalia or Versailles or the Congress of Vienna or the famous meeting between the Athenian admiral and the fellow in Milos, is that when they talk about what happened on that day or what was resolved on the day, they're taking really a Polaroid shot. You got a picture of what's going on and where everybody stands. And as soon as that picture's changing, and here I'm going back to my high school physics about the Heisenberg principle of how things change in front of your eyes. I mean, you're on to the next issue. So every issue that's resolved becomes every issue that has an outcome becomes the issue again later on. As soon as it's done, it becomes a new thing. Today, it's about what did Richard Nixon and others, what did they really mean about coming to terms with China on Taiwan? Is it really an all-Chinese affair? What did we agree to? We got Chinese assistance with the Soviets versus letting the Chinese have a free hand in Taiwan. So people today say, would America go to war for Taiwan? I don't know, and I'm not betting any money on this one. But it all depends on how people view those agreements. Now, in Oxford's kind of like Bible of treaties, I wrote a couple essays there on what a treaty is, whatever you call it, a convention or a solemn treaty. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. As long as two groups of people agree on something, that's sort of a treaty. And it's binding. It's binding between those two nations. And it's got nothing to do with larger bodies of like the United Nations and all the rest of it, or the League of Nations before that, or even the Council of Congress of Vienna in 1814 or 1815. It's got to do with what two nations or what two people think they're doing. And so the first thing I look at when I look at diplomacy, I want to know if the two people in the room really represent the people they say they're representing, or they're just representing themselves. So, the diplomat has to follow instructions, and then he or she sends them back. But the interesting thing is when heads of states, is when Woodrow Wilson's in the room in Versailles with Clemenceau, or Stalin's in the at Tehran and Yalta with Franklin Roosevelt, or Churchill is in the same room as Stalin, or when Adolf Hitler is in the same room with Neville Chamberlain. When you have the leader of the country in that room, you have summit diplomacy or personal diplomacy. And what's interesting about today is, as more and more nations become disillusioned with European Union diplomacy or globalization, whatever it is, what they're really getting disillusioned by, the big powers, is by multilateral agreements, multilateralism. And so I predict that in the next 10 years, we're going to get more of summit diplomacy or personal diplomacy at the top. Now, the interesting thing about Donald Trump, whether people like him or not, and in many ways, he's completely unlikable. In other ways, I can see why a lot of Americans are attracted to somebody who wants to just get through all the red tape. Barack Obama couldn't sit down with Putin. And the last time I saw him standing next to President Xi, there was a great deal of bad body language going on. And American presidents before Trump couldn't sit down with Chairman Kim from North Korea. I mean, the thing that I like about Trump, he's got all the world leaders, all of whom would go to war with him tomorrow over certain issues. He's got them all on speed dial. So he's kind of brought summit diplomacy back to the center. And the Chinese think they know all about Trump. They regard him, his comments as unfettered. They want to know what he has to say behind closed doors and what his representatives have to say. But the fact that we have an American president who's so out of favor with his own allies, whether it's NATO or other people, he's told to pay their bills. The fact is that he's got the world's protagonists on speed dial. I think this strikes me as this is new territory. I mean, he can get these guys. He might not be able to stop war. I mean, when the Seventh Fleet was headed for North Korea, Admiral Harry Harris had his orders from the Pentagon that if the North Koreans engage him, the order was to fire back, and there would have been war with North Korea, and millions of people would have died. And people say, "Oh, we can't have millions of people dying." Well, one of the things about COVID-19 diplomacy, as we start to get into the blaming game, is that millions of people might still die. I mean, this idea that we are immune from large loss of life is sort of a mental trick. I mean, we're not immune to a large loss of life. It's looking at it straight in the face. So people talk about Trump's arguments with the Chinese now about who's to blame. So it's called COVID diplomacy. It poisons everything else, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, to get back to the original story, I think diplomacy cuts right into these other cultures, tells us a great deal about them. And of course, the more you know about other people, the more you know about yourself. I mean, that's the beauty of, that's what Socrates is telling us, the life of the mind. He's not saying the life of the mind is a lot of fun. He's saying that without it, there is no life. Because if you can't understand what's going outside your door, it can't inform your life, and it makes you no better than the animal kingdom. As I like to say, the Army manual used to say, animals learn from their own mistakes. We learn from the mistakes of others. But sometimes these mistakes keep repeating themselves. Okay, I'm going to give you a question here. Otherwise, I won't.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I agree. I want to echo that you can learn so much about yourself by learning, like we talked about in the other episode, by learning about history and learning about what other people are like. Because at the end of the day, we're all pretty much the same. Like you said, we want the same things. We go after the same things. We do the same silly mistakes over and over. But two things that I really got out of your answer there that I want to touch on. I love this idea that you can learn pretty much everything from diplomacy, because what you're seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you learn about diplomacy, what you're seeing is not just a person who's going from country to country learning about one specific issue, but they're dealing with poverty, with food shortages, they're dealing with the economy, they're dealing with tyrannical leaders, good leaders. They're dealing with absolutely every single aspect of the human condition, right? And they're trying to figure out what's happening over here, what's happening where I come from, and how can we meet some sort of good balance there. I also like what you said about, obviously we hear this over and over again in the news, this idea that, hey, listen, if our neighbors are safe and happy, then we will be safe and happy. So there's a real need to have people going out there and speaking to other countries and making sure that their needs are also taken care of so that unrest doesn't happen. But the last thing that I want to point out that really took me in your answer there was the kind of questions that you're asking. And this is probably a result of you're a historian. You're good at asking questions, but it's looking at these situations and saying, yeah, who was in the room? What are their motives? Who are they working for? Are they really working for that person? And asking all those deeper questions. So, I love this, and I'd love to jump into a little bit more about the history of diplomacy. Maybe some of the key figures, some of the key events that happened that shaped diplomacy and the way that we do it today. So if you want to jump into that, and I'm sure I've got heaps more questions. And before you jump into that, I just want to point out that I'm gonna read you something from Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, soon, which has very much to do with diplomacy as well. But I want to jump into some of the key aspects of history about diplomacy.
Well, we try to categorize different kinds of, or what goes into human nature. What do people think they're doing? Is it, when they make a move, is it enlightened self-interest, or is it pure self-interest? Is it defensive, or is it fearful? I've heard people say that almost everything about American foreign policy since 1780s has been fear of other things, as opposed to doing other things. But look, for me, the starting point in my head is that Athenian general who went to the island of Melos and told them to stop aiding Sparta, or terrible things will happen to them. This Melian dialogue, which becomes the basis of realism. I mean, if political scientists knew anything about history, they know exactly what this was all about. And this is not only ancient diplomacy at work, it's the first time we see the militarization of diplomacy. That is, the military is carrying out the diplomacy of this particular Spartan state, the way the Prussians carried out German diplomacy in the 19th and 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. It's this militarization. And he says to these leaders in Milos, he says, you must cease and desist immediately supporting our enemies. And the guy says, we're going to have a conversation about this. And the Athenian admiral makes it very clear that if you don't stop right now, terrible things are going to happen. What's going to happen? The men are going to be killed, and the women and children are going to be sold into slavery, and the lands will be burned and salted, okay? That place isn't going to be going for a long, long time. And so the Milos, the guy from Milos says, look, we still have to confer. Actually, he's trying to buy time. And a lot of diplomacy, a lot of defensive diplomacy over history is about buying time. It's very important. And I'll get into that later on when I get to the 20th century, buying time. So the admiral, the good diplomat that he is, and I like military diplomats, they cut right to the quick. There's no discussion of Voltaire or anything like that. They're not interested in philosophy or literature. And he says
this sounds exactly like a scene from The Godfather, where he sends somebody over to another one of the heads of the families to send them a message, right?
And the message is crystal. He says to them, the powerful do what they can. The weak do what they must. He makes it very clear that if they don't play by these rules, and keep in mind throughout history, whether it's been, who's ever the hegemon of the day, that people have modified behavior until the next wave or crew comes in, and they say no, and they are destroyed. And so this so-called realistic dialogue becomes the benchmark or the baseline for the realist approach. Now, the opposite of realism is not unrealism; it's idealism. It's imagining that if you pursue a goal, that it has transcendent values, and that the other guy will come around to it. If you just listen to me. Well, listening is not enough. If people do not see it in their interest, and in fact, it might even be there's a phrase that was very popular after World War II that people have forgotten. It's about enlightened self-interest. Sometimes you must do something for your neighbor or your adversary or the person you're talking to, which is in your interest too. And the idea is not to say, like Donald Trump says, after the North Koreans get rid of their nuclear weapons, they can have golf courses. They're not interested. But, Americans are interested in getting North Korea to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And the Athenian admiral was very concerned about getting the people on Milos to support his position. And they wouldn't go along with it. So to me, that's kind of like the extreme realist view. Either you do what I tell you to do, or you don't exist. And you might think that the people from Milos were naive, but they preferred to die on their feet than on their knees, to quote some guy from Belarus lately. They knew what was going to happen, but they felt there was no room to maneuver. Now, one of the great diplomats of all time is Jesus Christ. When someone says, "What if Rome is on your back?" and the New Testament says something about you give the Caesar his due and you give God his due. You can break it up, but when you got laws that are enforced with an iron fist, we're not talking about the next world. I mean, every ancient civilization that back 3,000 years we can read about has got another world. It's about dealing with reality. And, you just can't keep trying to walk through a wall because it doesn't work. Sooner or later, you're going to knock yourself out and everyone's going to be terribly disappointed in you. Now, the secret here, every negotiation, whether it was in the 8th century with the kingdom of Euphrates, or 4th century BC with the Egyptians, whatever it is, that every diplomatic negotiator has some kind of leverage, some kind of advantage. And the rule is, and I got this from one of the great negotiators, Polonitsa, who wrote NSC 68 about acquiring nuclear weapons in the early 50s. And he had a life of diplomacy. He says that the negotiator, the diplomatic negotiator, or what makes all diplomats, gives them a common theme as their role as negotiators. He calls it diplomats quad negotiators. He says they are required to ask for or obtain a little more than their position allows, but never less than their position requires. So, if you've got leverage, you're supposed to at least get a little bit more than you might be entitled to, but never less than you're required to get entitled to. Now, if you walk into a room and you've got no leverage, like the Czechs who went to see Hitler, had him summoned, the president of Czechoslovakia, and told him to roll over in early 39 when they were coming in for the rest of the Czech Republic. The Czechs, it's too late. The Western allies, or France and Britain, had already abandoned them in 38 in September. No one was going to go to war for the Czechs, so the Czechs, they rolled over. And so whether it's the Red Army in 1945 marching through the ancient lands of Eastern and Central Europe, you got to roll with it. And you wait for another day. I think there was a great expression during the Cold War about adjusting to your circumstances, and it was better read than dead, because we're going to outlive these guys. And I was in Czechoslovakia in celebration of their return to independence, and it was quite clear they knew how to survive. And one day it's the Germans are marching in, and then after the Second World War is over, then the Russians are marching in. In fact, they had the same headquarters, Nazi headquarters and the Red Army headquarters were the same building, which is where my conference took place. And they learned, let's call it adaptability. You learn how to adapt through study of your nation's own diplomacy. And you learn some very important things. I mean, here in Australia, just to jump ahead for a moment, you can't understand Australian diplomacy without understanding Australian geography. Sometimes geography tells you what your diplomacy is going to be. For example, in this country, you got something like thousands of miles of coastline, and you need a navy if you're going to keep somebody out. And so you need allies to do this kind of thing. So you got 12,500 miles of coastline, which is the distance between Sydney and London via Suez. So early on, Australia had this deal. And the imperial deal was, they'll give the British troops to use in the Middle East, whether it's First World War or Second World War, in exchange for protection from whom? Well, the Yellow Peril, whatever it is, to the north of them. So they counted on the British Navy as part of their imperial trade-off. That was the great diplomatic bargain that Australians made. And they became a federation. And that was built into it, sort of baked in. People don't talk about it because it sounds a little cynical. But I'll tell you, after the British Navy was blown out of the water off the coast of Malaya in February 1942, the deal was over. Australians wanted those troops back in the Middle East. They wanted their own damn Air Force and all the rest of it. And so, sometimes you look at the geography, and there's Milos surrounded by water, dealing with an admiral who's got the ships. Well, that one's kind of a foregone conclusion. You can tease it out, or you can delay it a little bit. The Czechs are right in the middle of two warring factions. That is the Imperial Germans and the Nazis, and then the Red Army. And so they're caught, the meat in the sandwich. And so they're going back and forth. I said to the Czechs, I said, have you had reconciliation commissions or adjudication commissions about returning properties to people, or war crimes by either side, or by collaboration? And he said, no. He said, they decided not to go there because it would be too messy. There are too many collaborators who collaborated with the enemy, etc. But on the diplomatic track, we learn a lot about why these nations made these choices by just looking at a damn map and seeing their geography. Sometimes geography tells you everything. And then you also learn something else. What are they selling these other people? I mean, what are the Greeks, what are the Spartans selling what are the Athenians selling the people of Milos? What are they selling? And what are Western powers trying to sell people after World War II? What were the communists selling in the 1930s? And this is always very interesting, because diplomacy carries with it value-laden terms about, we're going to offer you this, this, and this, and does this interest you? And I mentioned in the last podcast, I had a chance to study comparative communist systems for 18 months in Vienna, and I got to go through the Soviet bloc, and I early learned that they didn't have anything I wanted. In fact, they didn't have anything that many people wanted. And my observation as a young man was they couldn't come up with the price point of anything. Not only did they not have anything that we wanted, but they couldn't tell you what anything cost that they had. Now we're going from values to the physical stuff. So when diplomacy sort of exposes a number of things. That's why geographers, historical geography, used to be the linchpin to understanding diplomacy. Because if you understood people's geography, for example, you're surrounded by, or you have a big coastline, and you're next to Canada, and so most of your diplomacy in that neck of the woods is going to be a maritime dispute, or who gets the fish. Same thing in the South China Sea right now. Who gets the oil, the gas, the fish, that kind of thing. So geography tells you a great deal, but the value systems. Now, I said diplomacy is a wonderful way to cut into foreign cultures so we can understand ourselves. I mean, I could come at this, look at the philosophers of each country. We could look at the literature of each country. We can do it a number of ways, but it seems to me that diplomacy, as I understand the term, subsumes everything else. It literally takes into account people's interests, their value systems, how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and when they're thinking. It seems to me that, the way history used to be the queen of the social sciences and history and humanities, that diplomacy was at the top of the game. Now, diplomatic history is hardly studied in universities in those terms anymore. Now they have courses called intercultural history and stuff like that. But diplomatic history is part and parcel of the history curriculum for hundreds of years. And I think it's making a comeback because, who's going to work the foreign service, the consular offices? Who's going to work for the NGOs, the INGOs? I mean, even Doctors Without Frontiers have to know where the hell they're going and what they're going to be dealing with. And I've talked to people who work in countries that are overrun by terrorists. These are highly idealistic young men and women who then have to cut deals with terrorists to deliver emergency goods to people. It's all about cutting and crossing these different boundaries. And without a diplomatic framework, without knowing how to work with these people. Now, this is not about the art of negotiations. I'm not talking about how FBI profilers always get their man, that kind of thing. I'm talking about negotiations between peoples and the navigating of conflicting ideas. We're not talking about getting somebody out of, Cafe Lynch. It was some guy said it was about negotiations. Yeah, well, it wasn't about negotiations. It was about the failure to understand the importance of the impact of terrorism and what it can do to people and what they really want. I mean, terrorists, for example, they don't have diplomacy. They just want to hurt people. So when we treat them like negotiators, we're playing a really dumb game. We don't understand where they're coming from or what they want to do. But look, I think diplomacy cuts through a lot of this kind of stuff, and it gives us a very clear view. Now, then you get a body of knowledge. It's called international law. And international law is not something that comes from Sermon on the Mount. It comes from accumulated customary law and other kinds of things that the great nations of the day, whether it's the 2nd century, 5th century, or 8th century, whatever it is, it's what they agree on. That's what international law is. The international law is what people can agree on. And even if they can't agree on its implementation later, it's still there to remind people. You know, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 outlawing war. Well, it didn't outlaw war at all. It ushered in this terrible Second World War. On the other hand, the principles and ideas laid out in those laws have become kind of our benchmark about how we move forward. I mean, it's there. But the international law is what the great powers say it is. You know, in the 19th century and early 20th century, the British didn't want to know anything about maritime law that wasn't written by them. You know, they had the British Navy made them the authors of the laws. They weren't going to agree to a damn thing unless it squared with them. So when Woodrow Wilson says he wants freedom of the seas and stuff like this, is one of the main results of the First World War. The British look at him and say, "Nah, we're gonna define this a little differently." So anyway, I think diplomacy allows us to look at these experiences, to draw lessons from these experiences, to learn things that would make us a little smarter, whatever it is next time. And I think it's a brilliant career. Now, a lot of people study diplomatic history without reading it. You know, sometimes people say, "Look, I don't want to read diplomatic history. It looks boring. It's what one clerk says to another." Well, actually, it isn't. When you go into a movie theater, an art house, and you see a German movie or a Spanish movie or a Russian movie, and you see how these movies probe the souls of these different cultures and nationalities, you're getting the diplomatic view of how things work. You know, they may even have references and words that mean the same thing, or maybe they mean slightly different things. And so you get to see how people deal with reality, how they deal with the material world, and what they think is important. And so, you know, even going to a foreign movie or trying to read literature, or God forbid, learning a foreign language, it just opens all these other doors, which all lead back to the diplomacy of these countries and their external outlook. Because when you get to the diplomacy of a country, it really tells you a lot about who they are, what they think they are, where they're going. I mean, it's, as I say, I always thought diplomacy reveals the soul of a nation. Their laws reveal the heart of the nation, but the soul, where it thinks it's going. And jumping into diplomacy, I think, and sure, you know, how much can you prepare for this? You just jump into the deep end. You know, I've seen all these people who speak perfect Spanish, perfect Portuguese, and so what's their first job? Is working in China. They tend never to send people where they have all this expertise. And on the other hand, you got some people who've done really nothing with their lives except make money, who wind up as secretaries of state, international trade negotiators. You get people, you know, when you know, during this recent impeachment proceedings, when they introduce people at those hearings as the leading expert on the Ukraine or Eastern Europe or Central Europe or Russia, I'm looking at these people and I'm saying, where in God's name did they get these people? What are their great books? What are their great ideas? And it turns out they got a little bit of experience, so they might speak Ukrainian, etc., and they become the experts. And so when they tell the political appointees what they think is going on, like Donald Trump is subverting the Constitution of the United States, other people don't believe a damn word they say because they don't have the credentials. I mean, they just don't have the credentials. So we get a lot of people who understand other nations who never quite get in a position to influence policy. And this is the nature of the beast. This is why I like the age where you had philosopher kings and warrior kings and warrior diplomats. These are people at the top of their societies who knew where they were headed, and they spoke for everyone else. Or at least they thought they spoke for everybody else. And so I think that's very interesting right there. But as I say,
let's jump into that. Sorry. Let's jump into the somewhat of a philosophical side here, because I want to share a passage to you that I think you'll find quite interesting. I found it really interesting, and I just happened upon it today when I was studying. But I love what you say, how this diplomacy, it's not just between governments. It's like, yeah, the philosophers, it's the culture, it's every aspect. And I came across this passage today. It was a letter written to Zeno the philosopher, who was the founder of Stoicism, right? And as I'm reading from Diogenes, the lives of the eminent philosophers, I'm finding here there's so many great examples of how the rulers of these nations really looked up to the philosophers of their time. But King Antigonus. Anyway, I'm going to have to get that right. But anyway, he says this to Zeno in his letter. While in fortune and fame I deem myself your superior, in reason and education I own myself inferior, as well as the perfect happiness which you have attained. Wherefore I have decided to ask you to pay me a visit, being persuaded that you will not refuse the request. By all means, then, do your best to hold conference with me, understanding clearly that you will not be the instructor of myself alone, but of all of Macedonians taken together. For it is obvious that whoever instructs the ruler of Macedonia and guides him in the paths of virtue will also be training his subjects to be good men. It is the ruler, such for the most part of it may be expected, that his subjects will become. So there's this idea in this letter, and Zeno actually writes back and says, well, I can't go because I'm old and I'm frail and I'm not going to be much use to you, but I can send some of my people who have learned from me who are just as smart. But there's this kind of idea in there that, hey, listen, I, the ruler of this nation, want to learn from you, because if I learn from you, then I can teach that to my nation, and you will be guiding the nation by guiding me. Is this a form of diplomacy as well within a nation?
Absolutely. It's as soon as you get the interaction of two people or more, and one's informing, one's listening, etc. This is the essence of diplomacy. You got a sender and you got a receiver, and you got enough language between them where they understand each other. And I think it's crucial that the king says to him, "Look, I'm the boss, but when it comes to these ideas, I'm going to defer to you, okay?" And the other guy says, "Look, I'm too old to travel." Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But I'm going to send my students to you. See it. So, you need a sender and a receiver, as you do in any kind of diplomatic arrangement. And they have to have enough in common and enough difference to make sense to each other. If two people are so much the same, that's why you get two people arguing on a ship or stuck in a room somewhere. They agree with each other so much, they're going to drive each other crazy, because they don't pass real information. They're passing emotions back and forth because they have the same kinds of beliefs. But this is the classic example of diplomacy, is that, and I hear it all the time in America. This guy, Graham Ellison, is talking about there should be a panel of elders, mainly historians and others, who have an acquired wisdom that they can pass on. And mind you, this goes the other way. Socrates wasn't killed or has to commit suicide because he corrupted the youth, which he may have. He was trouble. He was a smart ass because he was calling the system into question. So sometimes philosophers can get very dangerous to kings and to the leaders. And so, the philosophers have always admired their ability to leave skid marks. Because they're always in the firing line if you speak truth to power and that kind of thing. So whereas they can be enormously influential, and look at, my God, Frederick the Great used to spend all of his spare time with Voltaire. He just wanted to learn from the man. And there have been American presidents who have been enthralled to bring people into the White House. I have a colleague and friend, John Geddes, who's written about 7 books in the Cold War. They're all the same books in the Cold War, but no one knew that. And he was invited into George Bush's White House, where he regaled Bush with Cold War history and what the post-Cold War world could look like, et cetera, what America was doing in Iraq in 2003. So this Cold War historian was invited to the White House to raise the conversation. And I think at the end of the day, he did a pretty good job by raising awareness. Now, this is the other thing about the people you're quoting and the other things. I think And a lot of people are going to disagree with me. I think serious people over millennia, the serious people have written plays or essays or books. Today, serious people write books. And if you don't like these books from which other nations and people can study and criticize, then you're not a serious person. So when I hear someone is a leading authority on Ukraine, and I can't find a damn book in the Library of Congress that they've written, I'm thinking, where are they getting this reputation? So, you got a lot of people on the cheap. I'm not going to mention any names, but there are people in major universities around the world who haven't done a damn thing except got the appointment. They haven't written the important books. Now, there was a day in Australia when they get a young man or woman and making them professors or head of departments with a promissory note. They'd all come good. Now, it all happened before the age of 39. Today, you become a professor after you've written or done or got your patent or whatever you've done. So today, you're supposed to have done these things. But there are a whole lot of people in high places who haven't done anything. And you think to yourself, where are they getting this wisdom, this knowledge? And as our great friend Henry Kissinger says, you could only be as smart in office with the ideas you bring in. And when you're out of ideas, you leave office. I mean, you only last as long as the intellectual capital is there. When you've got nothing to say, or you're drained, or you've tried half the things you want to do and they don't work, then it's time to go. This is why politicians have political ideas have a certain shelf life. But sometimes diplomats, they go on and on. And I think it's very important. If these great philosophers that you enjoy and that I enjoy, and the great historians, they haven't left these books behind. And they weren't all easy books to read. And many of them were controversial books. Some of them got them in trouble. Some of these books were burned by Hitler because Hitler couldn't bear reading these things, or his people couldn't bear reading about liberal philosophers. I think these books provide this kind of ballast to to diplomacy. You go into a nation. If I'm going to go represent my country in someplace else, I want to know what they read. What do the kids read in high school? What are the classic texts? What are they moving on? What do they think is true, good, and beautiful? When you get to Serbia and you find out that their number one book, their classic is called The Knife, written in the 19th century, I think. I mean, it says a lot about what you're dealing with. Very hard to deal with the Kingdom of Serbia in 1914, and again with the Serbs later on in the war of the former Yugoslavia. In other words, you go into a country, I want to know what their elite and not so elite. This leads us to the next area, which is, according to the Havana Convention, when you were appointed somewhere, you were assigned somewhere, you could only, according to the convention, this was codified in 1928, you could only deal with the government of the day. You could deal with the government. You had no permission. In fact, you were restricted from dealing with normal people. Now, of course, you'd meet the normal people on the golf course, at dinners, the normal people, the normal elites that go to these things. Now, the interesting thing about soft power, which is another name for public diplomacy, which came into being after the Second World Wars, diplomats trying to influence the foreign publics that they're assigned to. For example, during the Arab Spring, a number of American ambassadors were seen among the students. They weren't cheering them on. They were just there. And the students knew that they were there, giving them heart and strength. And that's that public diplomacy, that reaching out to the populations, trying, when they say the Russians are trying to interfere in elections. I get a kick out of this. We've been doing this for 1,000 years. Everybody tries to interfere in everybody's thought processes to turn to force leaders of countries to listen to their people. Because at the end of the day, public opinion is king. Public opinion provides the parameters beyond which you, I, and every diplomat has to work. You cannot go beyond the parameters. So today we try to influence public opinion. But before 1928, that was considered very unacceptable. And then after 1945, 1960, you got Radio Free Europe, you got the Russians trying to jam things. Everyone's trying to influence other people's outcomes to to produce governments and leaders who will do things more in line with what you want to do. So it works that way. So this diplomacy and morphs into soft diplomacy. So not only do you have diplomacy, which is the management between states, but you got diplomacy in the age of globalization, which is about corporations and NGOs and INGOs and IGOs like the World Trade Organization and the United Nations and the European Union. Then you got the soft diplomacy of each of these countries, how they're trying to affect people in other countries, what they want them to think, hopefully maybe what they will want their own governments to do. So they got all this kind of going back and forth. That's why in 2003, everybody in the world became an expert on weapons of mass destruction. Today, everyone's an expert on COVID-19, whether it left the lab or not, because the whole world's on social media. Now, social media doesn't change human nature or what people are going to do, but I'll tell you what, it gets the word around in a hurry. When the American diplomats got their freedom in 1782, it took 1 month for a letter from Philadelphia to reach Paris. Today, it's instantaneous. So what you do is you have less time to think about it. It doesn't change what you're going to do exactly, but it forces you to move a little quicker before you are overtaken by events.
I was actually going to ask about that, because globalization, we've got these massive companies that, you've got some companies in America that are actually, their revenue is larger than most countries. And so you've got these massive players on so many levels, and as you say, instantaneous communication. It's kind of a crazy situation. Do you think that one other thing you could even look at is hey, America is spreading their culture around the world very quickly on Netflix, social media. Like they're spreading their tentacles all over the world. Do you think that this is making diplomacy easier or harder?
Oh, I think it makes things easier, particularly the impact of American music and film, cinematography, and playwrights and things like that. American music. I once interviewed a bunch of people in East Berlin who tore that wall down on November 9th, 1989. And I said, what was the influence of America? And these are younger people, and they said to me, it was the music. And I said, well, come again, what do you mean? He says that they were empowered by the freedom of the lyrics. Just the lyrics sent them crazy. It made them want to become more creative and at odds with the party line or whatever the party was selling, So they were thinking outside the box. That's what great cultures can do. I mean, the Australian culture has an enormous impact around the world. People are fascinated by Australia. I mean, they don't know anything about us, but they're fascinated by a culture that goes back 70,000 years. They're interested in what Australians do today. I mean, Australians have always been the flavor of the month in Hollywood and in Washington. I mean, in Washington, Australians are smart. They got the only damn grass tennis court in the whole capital of Washington. So when they have their barbecues on Sundays and they invite everybody over, everybody goes to play on the grass. I mean, even movie stars don't have grass tennis courts anymore because they take about $60,000 a year to maintain. You got to roll the damn things every day. And so, Australians have, what's the famous phrase? Have always hit above their weight, both militarily, socially, culturally, and diplomatically.
Yeah, they definitely have, and you can see that around the world. I mean, my brother, works over in America. He's, pretty much part of the whole, industrial military complex over there. And he often tells me that Australia absolutely punches above its weight, and that the American military very much respects everything about the Australian military as well. And, I wanted to ask a question about kind of you might say, the flavor of international relations at the moment. Because obviously we see a lot of countries, going back and forth with China's relations at the moment. There's a lot of name calling. There's a lot of harsh words being spoken, especially in Australia, since our Prime Minister was pretty much first off the bat in terms of really calling for a serious investigation in China. How do you see this playing out from a diplomatic standpoint?
Well, the diplomacy of Sino-Australian, Sino-American relations is going to determine kind of the future of countries. I mean, right now, half of Washington is preparing for war with China, and the other half of Washington is trying to figure out how to avoid war with China. And the only way to avoid war with China is to engage them diplomatically in terms of trade, COVID-19, technology, and all the rest of it. I mean, it's the diplomatic side of the house that's going to get us out of the other side of the house, which is thinking, if there is a conflict, how long is it going to last and what's going to happen? And none of that is very pleasant. Now, I think we're counting a great deal here. Now, I think a lot of people around the world are trying to make a decision whether to stick with the Americans right now, even though they are retreating, or maybe they might have to cast their lot with someone else, or maybe try to remain neutral. Now, in 1800, the United States is a very fragile democracy. And they got this huge war going on across in Europe and in the New World between revolutionary France and Great Britain. And the Americans had an alliance with the French from the 1770s, 1778. And this alliance was abrogated by the Americans, by John Adams, in 1800 because it was getting the Americans in too much trouble. That is, if the French were to get the Americans involved in a conflict with the British again in, say, the Caribbean, where the Americans would then suffer another war with Britain, which they did not want to handle, by the way, the Americans regarded that as just too onerous. No nation has the right to commit suicide. You got to do what you got to do to survive. And so John Adams, who's a very proud New Englander, he abrogates this treaty with the French. And the decision really is about, do you have a relationship with a country when you sign a treaty, or do you have a relationship with the people who sign the treaty? Well, George Washington made it very clear in his time that it deals with the country, not with the individual people. Originally it was with the King of France, and then it went on to revolutionary France. So the Americans got out in 1800 because they didn't want a war with Britain at that stage, would have broken their backs. Now, in 1812, they had another war of independence with Britain, which nearly broke their backs, but they got lucky again because by this time the British were completely embroiled in war in Europe. So America was able to take care of those distresses. Today, people in Eastern Central Europe, they say, well, should we accommodate Putin or do we hang out with Americans and NATO as defense against this? And this is all about the diplomacy of military relations. And same thing in this part of the world. People say, well, do we have to choose between Washington and Beijing? And it's quite clear that Beijing is never going to invade Australia, but it can make life miserable here through the diplomatic punishment it can impose on Australia by removing its international students, its investments, its tourism, and that kind of thing. I mean, they could starve Australia. What the Australians don't know, of course, is that China needs Australia more than Australia needs China, because the Chinese economy is in such trouble right now. They can't afford to lose anybody. They can't afford to lose that coal, and they can't afford to lose that iron ore because it can't be replaced anyplace else at this time. Anyway, I think the diplomacy.
Joe, you're whispering there. Am I going to be put on a list after releasing this episode? Am I going to be like on some sort of some sort of
No. It's just that I was thinking about that today the diplomacy, the Chinese diplomacy in America is very important because it's going to determine what happens in trade and technology and overall relations. And there is even a tendency in America now to, there are analysts who are looking for ways to cooperate with Russia, maybe to tilt the balance against China. And they're taking the Atlantic Council in Washington's taking this very serious about what can we offer the Russians to keep the Chinese on their back foot, because Chinese are now seen as America's major strategic, diplomatic, economic and military rival. And so now we should maybe turn to Russia the way we turned to China in the early 70s, to tilt the balance against Russia. Now, I think that kind of reasoning is very spurious. China has, in terms of, when I look at China, I always say, how many nuclear weapons do they have? They got 260 nuclear warheads. America's got 6,000 nuclear warheads, and the Russians got 6,700. So I don't worry about Chinese diplomacy when I go to bed. I worry about something's going to happen to those weapons in Russia. I mean, are they going to threaten something? Is there going to be an inadvertent launch or something like that? I mean, I'm much more worried about Russia than China. But China right now is the flavor of the day because it's got this great economy, which as a result of COVID-19 is now facing its first negative growth in 50 years. So President Xi has to explain in his own internal way to his population what went wrong. And Donald Trump is saying, and this is what we mean by COVID diplomacy, he's saying that what's happened is a result of the failure of the Chinese, at least to tell people what was going on, and at worst, spreading COVID-19, maybe without realizing it. And some people say that maybe they did realize it. And so this is this COVID diplomacy, whether it's going to accelerate the trends that are going on, or whether it's been factored through the system already. So we got all this diplomacy at high levels, and the diplomacy here will reflect the frameworks that come out of this. Now, can the diplomatic quarrels between America and China right now, can it help solve the problems? Will trade be affected? And of course, economic diplomacy is the number one thing after military diplomacy. I mean, the economic diplomacy is, foreign economic policy is part and parcel of how diplomacy. That's why they say in Australia, it's not the Department of Foreign Relations anymore, but Department of Foreign Affairs. When Australia became a working nation, it was called Department of External Relations, which is a very good way to look at the world. Then it was Department of Foreign Affairs, and then it was Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because trade is the essential element of economic diplomacy is an essential element in the carrying out of the conduct of diplomacy. Well, that's the story that people tell each other anyway. So yes, I think Chinese diplomacy and how we handle it, how the whole world handles it. Right now, China, despite all their great efforts and their great positive diplomacy, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, which was seen as an attempt to spread globalization, I think right now that China is sort of looking at this rising tsunami of anti-Chinese feeling and asking themselves, how did it get to this point? And I think diplomacy has a major role to play in the next 5 years about how we get out of this economic slump we're all going to be in, and how we get about solving future problems. You know, the UN pointed out before COVID-19 that there were 37,000 people a day who, out of fear and afraid, left their homes, whether it was Syria, Afghanistan, whatever it was. And today, the UN tells us that 247 million people in the third world, what now called the global south, are marching towards starvation and poverty. That we have a whole new class of poverty. So this sort of cools the hopes of the sustainable development goals, because they're all going to be set back. And so we're going to have economic diplomacy, we're going to have water diplomacy, security diplomacy, and global warming, and we're going to have, of course, nuclear diplomacy and how we get rid of the war on terror, which is still in the background. So we have that kind of diplomacy going on too. So diplomacy and how we negotiate these things in the years ahead plays a key role. And I'm very happy to say that some of the brightest students I've seen in 45 years have gone on to have diplomatic roles, whether it's Department of Defense, they have a diplomatic role to play, or whether it's foreign affairs and trade, or whether they're analysts or intelligence operators. These are people who see the outside world and they interpret the outside world for the Australian machinery government to deal with it. So when a prime minister speaks to a Chinese leader, or a foreign minister here speaks to their opposite number, they should have on their desk all these particular briefings. I mean, diplomacy sometimes provides a tipping point. There was a famous instance in April 1945. Franklin Roosevelt had died. His position was taken over by this I'm not going to say relative ingenue. This is Harry S. Truman. Truman knew his way around the world. He just wasn't very sophisticated. And Molotov, the gruff Russian leader, is going to see Truman on his way to the new UN conference in San Francisco. Up to this time, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies, and very few harsh words. No harsh words were spoken. Franklin Roosevelt was going to integrate Soviet war aims that didn't do too much damage into Western war aims. And when Truman succeeded him, Truman was rushed by all these people who had complaints about Roosevelt's policy of appeasement or accommodation. And so Truman asked his State Department for a profile on Molotov, who's coming through. Molotov is going to pay his respects to the new president on his way to San Francisco. And this is after the Soviet government had recognized their own communist cadres in Poland. That is, they were cutting deals with the new Polish government, which was supposed to be with all the allies. That was agreed to at Yalta. So Truman is not quite sure how to treat Molotov. So someone in the State Department writes him a profile about how to treat him, what he might expect, and kind of things he's used to. So Molotov comes to the door, and he says, he welcomes him, or he congratulates him and all that. He brings the words from Stalin. And then Truman rips into him in four-letter words about how this relationship we have is not a two-way street, and that you have to back off the Poles, because there's a lot of Poles who vote in Detroit too, and that's not what we agreed at Yalta. So he's literally taking shreds off this guy based on his State Department memo on how to treat him. So here's a classic example of some Russian expert who thinks he knows Molotov, who thinks that Molotov responds to four-letter words, and Harry S. Truman had a lot of four-letter words coming from Kansas City, Missouri. And Molotov says two things. He said, these are the first harsh words that have been spoken between the Allies since Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in July 41. And at this point, and he also says he's not used to being talked to like that. Now, I find it very hard for a guy who's worked all of his life for Joseph Stalin, who hasn't been talked to like that. Stalin always treated his people like spiders treat flies, they had him in suspense all the time. So as a result of this diplomatic profile, we are now into a full-scale Cold War with the Soviet Union based on this now war of words, which then generates into far more sinister things as we move forward. So this is a good example of how, when I say diplomacy, I'm talking about not only the practitioners and the foreign ministers, I'm talking about the analysts who work on all these various desks and these different regions who provide crucial advice at different times. And so all of these people are part of the diplomatic process. And so there's a classic example. Instead of looking, people think diplomacy is about compromise. Well, actually, it's not. It's about leverage. And Harry S. Truman had a heap of leverage in 1945. The United States was untouched by the Second World War. On the other hand, Molotov had a little bit of leverage too. That is, the Red Army had liberated all the ancient capitals of Eastern and Central Europe. They are in place, and they are there to do one thing, and that is to create a diplomatic, economic, and physical barrier between them and the next German invasions. They didn't trust Germany for the third time around. They wanted to make sure that Eastern and Central Europe at least had a foreign policy that was aligned with Soviet foreign policy. But they got lucky. And when they entered all these countries, they sent in their own teams of people who might have been Poles or Czechs who were trained in the Soviet Union under the days of the Comintern and the international kind of thing. So the Soviets decided to, put out all the lights in Eastern and Central Europe. So that was their leverage. They had physical capture of Eastern and Central Europe. Truman's leverage is he's got all the economic resources in the world to help carve that next new world. And the Soviets got two choices. They can join his version, or they can go doing what they're doing. Well, they went on to do what they were going to do with it anyway. But a good example of how a diplomatic analysis shapes the future. Same thing in George Kennan's famous long telegram, where he said that the Soviet Union was, and at this time he's number 2 man in Moscow, the acting charge, and he says the Soviet Union, in effect, is an ideology in the possession of a state. It's a war. It's a messianic, world-conquering ideology, which is not like Hitler, though. They do stop if you resist them from time to time. And so, and he goes on to give an explanation or a rationale to people in Congress about why they should be hardline Soviets or anti-communists. And of course, you don't need a reason to be anti-communist in America. There are anti-communists since 1917, large sections of the population. So the point is that these diplomats not only provide the practice in various places, they provide the analyses, which then informs an entire country's foreign policy or attitude towards these other nations. And now in this country, I don't see much analysis about the Chinese. I must say, Kevin Rudd, I've been a little disappointed and did a beautiful piece a couple of weeks ago in Foreign Affairs, where he talks about the impact of COVID-19, the diplomacy between China and the United States. And, the story is that one of them is going to be the great winner at the end of all of this. And Rudd says very plainly, that there are no winners here. They'll both be in diminished positions when this is over, which is exactly the answer. Neither one of them has much to brag about right now, and they have a great deal to cooperate about right now. So we need that analysis, which is informed by people who study history, philosophy, literature, and especially diplomatic history.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And there's just so much going on around the world. It's so interesting. That's why I really wanted to talk about diplomacy with you, because it kind of seems like a success in diplomacy leads to peace around the world, and almost a failure in diplomacy is what leads. It's like diplomacy is the thing that leads to both outcomes, right? Whether it's war or peace. And so it's a very important discussion to have. Something that you mentioned there, which you also talked about in our last interview, I'd really love to ask this, and then I'll ask my final question after that. But you discussed this idea of the ideology being in possession of the state. Now, if I'm hearing you correctly, I interpret this to mean that you could look at ideology 2 ways. You could say that people are taking on the ideology, or that the ideology almost has some sort of metaphysical form, and it's just going around taking control of people's minds. Is that what you're talking about? And if so, how do you, as a historian, distinguish between an ideology taking control of a state and a state taking control of an ideology?
Well, I guess that's what Kennan and others tried to argue for the next 18 months after that memo or that telegram was sent. Now, when I say an ideology in the possession of a state, I mean, in this case, a messianic ideology, a world conquest, communist goals, taking over the machinery, taking over the state of Russia, one of the great powers. So this is what people meant. The messianic ideology taking possession of the state. Now, you can have a state that might be in the possession of the ideology. That is, you might have an ideology that's left or right, whatever it is, but it's still run by traditional thinking at the top. That they use the words to do what they're going to do anyway. Like in Venezuela, they got this guy Maduro, who's talking all kinds of left-wing stuff, and yet he moves and he talks just like a Venezuelan dictator. It doesn't make any difference whether he's left or right. He's doing what he wants to do. And same thing in Moscow. We got a post-communist society, which is driven by ideology. And I mean, they had the minister for ideology on that Politburo. And now it's controlled by people who want to get rich and who want all their friends to get rich. And they don't seem to have any ideology at all, aside from talking about the great iconic identifiers of Russian nationalism, the Eastern Russian, the Russian Church, and Mother Russia, and all these great themes. So in Russia today, we have a traditional state that's taken over the possession of how it thinks. Prior to that, it was a messianic ideology, which sort of lost the message by the time it got to Gorbachev, taking over a state. Now, in America, we have an American revolutionary movement, which is very conservative. It's about who's to rule and who's to rule at home. Now, American ideology, which by the 1780s had taken over the American Revolution, was a very conservative one in this sense. America was always a business civilization. It was about getting bigger, more profitable, more secure for its own people, providing those kinds of things. It's a business civilization. The founding fathers, and there were 77 of them, only 55 of them signed the Constitution. They were businessmen. They were slaveholders. They were lawyers. They were all businessmen. They weren't crazy. The only crazy person there who wasn't invited to sign anything was Thomas Paine. He was a philosopher. He was all in for revolution. That's why he went over to France and joined them for a while. So it's a business civilization. And then America has come to identify from the 1780s to the present time that the world must conform to American business. What I mean by that is America identifies its future, its present, its prosperity with an open door world. That's why freedom of navigation is important. Those sea lanes must be open. That's why America went to war with Germany in 1917. So America has identified its business, and America's business interests is if the world is open and America can compete, it will do very well. When when a world starts to get closed, or people are cheating, like the Chinese, the Americans say are cheating over technology and copyrights and stealing research and development, then they have to be punished. So Americans are committed to this open door world. American diplomacy is committed to this open door world. And yes, they also talk about human rights and other things, which seem to be secondary. It's not the primary driver of American diplomacy. And in China, the number one driver of diplomacy is the Communist Party of China. There are 90 million people there. And at the top, you got probably a couple hundred, maybe 12 in a room, which run the whole show. And Chinese diplomacy, Chinese foreign policy, everything is dedicated to maintaining the security of the Chinese Communist Party. And that Constitution doesn't say about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or anything like that. It's talking about maintaining the power of the Chinese Communist Party, which is a socialist party, has same dreams as Bolshevism about creating a workers' paradise. I don't see that happening. I didn't see that happen anywhere. And so what we have in China is the classic Communist Party or ideology, which possesses the Chinese mainland. And in America, we have the business principles, or business outlook, which dominates the American outlook on the world. So, America wants an open door world. China didn't want an open door world, but when it joined the WTO and became very prosperous and started, the economy started galloping, then they saw leverage in that world opening. So today, when people talking about cutting away supply chains and putting economic tariffs, barriers around China, that's very frightening to them because they played the game for a while and they did very, very well by it. Now, it's always thought in the West that if people play your game, they will absorb your values at the end of the day. And that's not how it works at all. they think, you play the game, you're gonna have our values. Well, they don't see it, as we can see what the Chinese are doing to their own Muslims. And if there's another Tiananmen Square incident, it's going to work out the same way it did the first time. And that's why the whole world, that's why the Western world, or everybody else, I suppose, is very concerned about what the Chinese are going to do with Taiwan, and especially in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong diplomacy there, Chinese diplomacy in Hong Kong will be the bellwether about what happens elsewhere. But the number one relationship in the world today is Chinese-American relations, and the number one vehicle for that relationship is diplomacy and how it's played. It's played out every day on the front pages of the Global Times and in China and in the New York Times. We can see whether it's economics or it's about atmospherics or anything else. And so through the eyes of diplomacy, we can see exactly what's going on in the engagement between China and the United States, and with America's friends and allies who are all taking America's leads. When I was I've been going to security conference each year, places like Estonia and Lithuania, and I was in a room with EU diplomats and bureaucrats, and they are obsessed with Donald Trump has to say on his Twitter account in the morning. They were obsessed with Brexit. I mean, they were obsessed with how major nations were going to play the game. And so when the great nations, when the great powers play the game, and today, great power competition has replaced the bipolar nature of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was essentially Soviet-American nuclear rivalry. And today we got China, we got Russia, and we got the United States. We got three great powers with all these subsidiary powers like Iran and North Korea, things like that. We got all these great powers and nearly great powers playing the game. And we've lost that kind of certainty that you have from two people playing the game. We've left the playbook. There is no playbook. We're trying to figure out what the other people mean and what they do. And the trouble is without diplomacy, without diplomacy of some kind, we don't know what the red line is for each side. I mean, what's the red line for the Chinese before they would go kinetic, as they say, before there'd be a war? What's the red line for the Americans? Well, it was going to be Syria. That didn't work out. And then there's going to be a few other things that didn't work out. So, that's the great thing about diplomacy. It carves out these red lines, and it tells us what's going to happen next. I mean, without and I think the great thing about public diplomacy that's publicized is it's declaratory policy. It declares what the other side thinks is important or ought not to happen. And then you can negotiate behind closed doors. But without that diplomacy going on, most important, without the right people to conduct this diplomacy, we're not going to go anywhere in a hurry. In fact, we're going to get in a hell of a lot of trouble. And you saw what happened in 1914 when you had all these incompetent foreign ministers and diplomats giving each other working at sixes and sevens, and next thing you know, we got this war that nobody wanted, and everybody thought would end very quickly, which didn't end at all until all the powers that went to war disappeared. The Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, all the powers that went to war, who misunderstood each other's diplomacy, disappeared at the end of the war. That includes the Ottomans too. So at the end of World War I, everyone goes to war to hold up their empires. And at the end of it, they're all gone, and we got a brand new world. And so today we don't want to go that way because we got all these nuclear weapons. And let me tell you, just a small nuclear exchange would make COVID-19 look like a walk in the park. Thank you.
Yeah, seriously. It's, we live in such interesting times, hey, and there's so much to look at. And one thing that I love about what you're saying there, bit of a back spiel, like it's so difficult to have political discussions these days. And I think that one of the reasons why it's so difficult is because not a lot of people are willing to continue asking questions like you might ask as a historian or as a diplomat. They're not willing to ask more and more questions to find out more information that would be critical to the overall solution. People are basically looking at these political divides and these political situations going on through a very low resolution lens when it's actually a very high resolution picture. And something that you said, talking about the idea of America is going after business interests, and something that I often tell people is that you can't necessarily compare different countries to each other because the countries might not be playing the same games. Like when it comes to, say, healthcare for the citizens. America might be losing that game, right? Australia is doing really well. I know that because my dad recently had somewhat of a complication, immediately into hospital, best care possible, doesn't have to pay a cent for it apart from some small taxes. But America's game that they're playing, they're really good at, is innovation, business. It's a completely different game to the one that we might play in Australia. And what you've been talking about all through this is that diplomacy is the art of looking at all of the different angles of culture and business and international relations and trade, and all of that. Diplomacy takes in everything. And it can teach us how to have better conversations about these big issues, right?
Absolutely. Look, just finally here, it just occurred to me that one of the things we did terribly wrong about Vietnam or diplomacy there was, and I'm here quoting the great Asian China scholar John Fairbank, it said that America could only have failed in Vietnam because it didn't understand Buddhism, rice culture, or village mentality. Yeah. And because we didn't know how things worked at the hamlet level, and we didn't know these other things, that we were doomed to failure. So when we're talking about recreating and pacifying the hamlets over there, he said, we did it all wrong and we were doomed to failure. And then he says, at the end of the Vietnam War, in the New York Review of Books, he says, we were culturally blind. Our diplomacy was culturally blind. We did not know. It's just, to this day, we don't know what we don't know. No one learned anything. And we're going to repeat it again. So when we get involved in these, and this other thing about this low resolution, one thing you learn about when you start studying Asian cultures and Buddhism and all the rest of it, there are multiple truths. Today, everyone in America thinks there's one truth, and that if you don't agree with me, get the hell out of the room, or you get into a shouting match, or someone shoots each other because they can't. They think it's a debate. They think everything is a debate, and there's only one answer. It turns out that there may be multiple answers on that page that we could all live with. But the idea that there's only one way that this thing has to work out is suicidal. And this is where I think a lot of our problem in Washington is. And the president has ignored, the State Department through the president has ignored filling about 25 or 30% of the senior positions. There are acting people in place who, by the way, aren't getting paid for it. And we've lost a lot of really bright people who studied history and diplomacy and even literature. I mean, Harvard has been left out of this administration. The Brookings Institution's been left out of this. We got the great thought platforms in America are not part of the Trump administration. He's replaced them with other people from maybe very narrow business interests, et cetera. And so we don't have the great ideas, or they're not flowing through. And if you don't have these people who've been exposed to these different kinds of histories and ways of thinking, and our view is going to become more and more myopic instead of larger. But anyway, to get back to Fairbank's thing, without history and the study of diplomatic history, we are condemned to cultural blindness. Now, we can get away with this once in a while, but once it gets to the nuclear level, you're in a whole new game, okay? It's only a small miracle we haven't had a nuclear exchange in 75 years. But I'm saying that if there is a small exchange, when I say small, 15, 20 nuclear weapons, it will change the sky, the temperature, the weather, the crops, and everything else. I mean, we are condemned to nuclear winters, Carl Sagan used to say. But it's this cultural blindness. And I think the study of diplomacy, the study of human nature, the study of how other people see the world is crucial to how we survive. And without it, we don't survive. And to tell you the truth, we don't deserve to survive if we're going to just keep putting our heads in the sand. I mean, there are answers out there, but we got to look for them. And this low resolution, you make a very good point. People think it's a debate. If you don't agree with me, you hit the highway. Well, that's not how the real world works. The real world is far more complicated and I think far more nuanced than that.
If you have time for one more question, I think that bringing this all back to the ground level, what's so interesting to me about, and man, thank you so much for coming on again, because this has been so fascinating for me. what's really great about it is you can take diplomacy on every level. Like, you can bring it back to your own personal relationships. Everything that we've been talking about here, you can use in your own personal relationships. And when
Absolutely, that's what diplomacy is. Yes, yes.
Exactly. And when you were talking about all this sort of stuff, I thought of this great quote that I read from Zeno again today, because I was studying him. And I want to read this, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell us how people can use diplomacy in their own lives, or even in order to help governments or whatever. But there was this great scene. I'll set it up for you. So Zeno learned from this philosopher Crates of Thebes for about 20 years, this Cynic philosopher. And he also learned from a few others. And one day Zeno was sitting there listening to Stilpo, the philosopher, and he was learning from Stilpo. Well, Crates didn't like this. So he comes along and he grabs Zeno by the cloak and he starts to drag him away from Stilpo. And this is what Zeno said to him. And I think that you could almost say this is a perfect definition of diplomacy. He says to Crates, "The right way to seize a philosopher, Crates, is by the ears. Persuade me and then drag me off by them. But if you use violence, my body will be with you, but my mind will be with Stilpo." I thought that was a brilliant way to describe diplomacy, because it's the art of words, negotiation, discussion, trying to understand, as opposed to using violence. Is that kind of the right way to look at it?
Well, that's right. In my little book, Diplomacy with Oxford, one of the cynical definitions of diplomacy on page 1 is this British comedian, name is Caitlin, and sometimes people ascribe this to other people, but she said it. She said, well, diplomacy is saying nice doggy until I can find a rock. That's a cynical version. That's a cynical version.
That's
I go the other way. Diplomacy is how we negotiate with others, whether it's at personal level or state. We belong to companies or whatever it is. I mean, it's how you get on. I'd written in my book about the importance of leverage and asking for a little more than your position would allow. And a famous agent in Britain called me up and said, "Look, I read this passage, and would you like to write a book for me on how we can use your principles in everyday life?" He said, "You can make a lot of money." I said, "Look, I'd like to make a lot of money, but if I wrote a book at this point in my career about how you use diplomacy every day, people would just remember me as a how-to book. They wouldn't read the other. It's like the guy who wrote Love Story. He was a great classical. He knew a great deal about antiquity, and when he wrote this book, he became very famous with this little sort of maudlin tale of two people in love, one of whom was dying. He became so famous that his colleagues no longer took him seriously. He didn't take any of his serious work seriously because he'd become popular. Now, I like being popular in the sense of being read, but I actually turned it down thinking, God, I don't want to be known as the guy who told you how to navigate your personal day relationships. That's exactly what diplomacy tells you to do.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. I love it. Well, Joe, I so appreciate you coming on here. As I said, everything that we talk about in this episode can be taken and used practically in people's lives. If like we talked about in the first episode, if you connect the dots, right?
That's right. You got to connect these dots, and also we have to do one session on nuclear weapons, where they come from and why they matter.
Joe, I'm going to talk to you as many times as possible. So put that one on the list, and we'll have you back really soon. All right, so there you have it, my interview with Professor Joseph Siracusa. Now, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed having that conversation, and you can find all of the links to his works in the show notes there as well. So we're going to have him back many more times, but until then, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time. But I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date with the Practical Stoic community and everything to do with this podcast, then just go to my website, simonjedrew.com, and subscribe to the Practical Stoic Weekly, a newsletter that I send out every week with updates and all sorts of great Stoic insights. You can also find me everywhere online by searching Simon J. E. Drew. See you next time.